Welcome to Finding Common Ground, a Summer of Peace summit where some of the world's brilliant change makers are offering cutting-edge peace practices for building bridges to create a comprehensive blueprint for global transformation. Please share this event with your friends and family, and also come join us on Facebook at the Shift Network. And now, your hosts Phillip Helmich, Director of Peace here at the Shift Network, and Sister Jenna, American Meditating Radio host and founder of the Brahma Kumaris Meditation Museums.
Welcome, everyone, to Finding Common Ground, the Summer of Peace Summit. This is our first day, and we're going to kick it off with the most amazing speaker, Shariff Abdullah. And before I even get him on, let us get a little bit of an idea of what we're about to embark on. For the next 3 days, we're going to look at ourselves and look at each other from a personal to an interpersonal to a collective dimension to see in what way we can actually find our own commonality, in what way we can learn to grow together, especially in these times. We're really, really thankful for the partners that are supporting us. Live a Moment movement and getting their app and really getting the calm going on and creating a story of goodness. We thank you. We thank you for your support. I'll be your co-host, founder of the Brahma Kumaris Meditation Museums, and I'm also the radio host for American Meditating Radio. And of course, I could not do this program without the amazing director of the Summer of Peace, Phillip Helmich. Phillip, are you excited?
I am so excited. I am so excited about this journey we're going to take over the next 3 days with everyone. We've just with everything in the news, you may not think finding common ground is possible. And we're going to be talking with amazing people who've really been in the thick of different conflicts and situations who are bringing out the best of humanity. And we'll learn a lot in this journey.
You know, I'm very concerned about what our children, our teenagers, and just what we are going through, collusion, treason, fake news, gun violence. How do we find common ground? How do we just deal with our spouses nowadays with just the bombardment of all of these things? So us doing this summit right now couldn't be more timely. And everyone who is tuning in, tell your friends, tell your relatives, tell your colleagues at work. This is a must. This is a must.
Yeah, and also engage with us over the next few days on social media. Go to the Shift Network Facebook page or Twitter account and use hashtag Summer of Peace. We really invite people to engage. And also the Live a Moment app. If you haven't downloaded that yet, definitely download it, and you can meet people from around the world. And we're in store for a lot of hope, inspiration, and grounded practical insights. So, yay, sister. Well, my dear friend, shall I introduce our first leadoff speaker here? And we intentionally, our leadoff speaker is Dr. Shariff Abdullah, and he's going to be talking with us about catalyzing common ground using the Common Way process. There's a lot we could say about Shariff. The thumbnail sketch is he's a visionary, author, consultant, and advocate for inclusivity and social transformation. He's worked in so many countries around the world, spanning 43 countries, 100 distinct different cultures. He's been working in corporations. There's lots and lots we can say. And we're starting off this summit with Shariff because of his real depth understanding of Common Way, of finding common ground on the personal, interpersonal, and the collective. And so, Shariff, thank you so much for being with us here in Finding Common Ground as part of the Summer of Peace.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this. This is, of course, with all of the news that Sister Jenna was talking about, all of the chatter going on. It's finding a moment of calm and finding a moment where there are people who are trying to elevate the conversation, not pander to the conversation. I think is really important. I think that's the way that we move forward.
Yeah.
And I have to say, Sharif, when I first met you last year at the Shift Network Vision 2020, did you remember how great we got along? Because
Absolutely.
we just knew what was
Yeah.
up and what was going on.
Mhm.
And I think that this is really everyone's story. I think there's there's an energy that's trying to trick us into the distraction, but
Mhm.
we're actually being given a tremendous opportunity to sink deep within and to rise above and to really spearhead into an age of truth that we know is coming. Despite whatever we're seeing now, there's something good coming out of this rubble.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to echo that, sister, because I was talking with one colleague today. It's like the extremism is actually, people are getting tired of it and want to be looking for the common way.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of this heat and friction is like, we can only take so much of it before we want some fresh air. And Sharif, what I love about your work is you worked in 100 distinct different cultures, 43 countries, in some really difficult conflict situations, and yet you've really distilled down some common elements. And common elements that can apply to the personal, interpersonal, collective. So I know in the past when we've hosted you, you've talked about deep identity. And so will you kick us off in this distilling down from your decades of experience? Start us off with deep identity here.
I will, but I'm going to go first back to Sister Jenna, what she was talking about, and just remind people that in all of the mindlessness, all of the numbness, we have a choice to make. It's not automatic that I have to turn on the television every time I walk in the door. It's not automatic that I've got to spend hours and hours on Facebook. No one's holding a gun to my head. I have a choice in that. Now, the choice may not be very obvious to me, but I think it's our job, those of us who can take a step back, to help others take that step back and say, you've got a choice to make here. Let's make the choice.
Mm.
And that actually gets us into this notion of deep identity. This is something that I began to discover after I left this culture, the American culture, and its subcultures, and started looking in other areas and started looking at other nations and started looking at other cultures and start recognizing that the same kind of influences that were pulling us down, we're pulling them down, although they have a completely different historical background. So when I started looking at this, I started observing something. Most of the things that people were fighting about had to do with issues of identity, of what their identity is. Sometimes that, excuse me, sometimes the issue has to do with race, sometimes it has to do with religion, sometimes it has to do with gender, but all of these things that are pulling at people, and actually sometimes are the causes of wars between people, all of them have to do with a part of your identity that you may want to call the core or your basic identity, or I'm calling deep identity. These are the parts of your identity that you acquired before the age of 7 years old. Now, the child psychologists say that at around 7 years old, or sometimes 8 years old, children learn abstract reasoning, they learn concrete reasoning, what's real, what's not real, etc. But your identity was in place before that structure was put there. So your deep identity are the parts of your identity that you lack the capacity to think about. You take these parts of your identity as though they are facts, as though they are real, as though that this is simply reality. Okay, and so if you saw these elements before you turn 7 years old, you are going to accept the world as given at that point. Now, is it possible to change the deep identity aspects? Yes, it is, but you have to understand that what you're bringing to the table. So we look at 5 different elements of deep identity. The first one is race, ethnicity, and culture. And immediately, you know, I'm cheating because we all know that race is different from ethnicity and ethnicity is different from culture. But when you're 2 years old, you don't know that. And you just absorb the whole thing as though this is called reality. The second part of deep identity is language. This is one of the reasons why, unless you were raised in a household that spoke multiple languages, when you hear someone else speaking a language you don't understand, you get uptight, you get nervous, and their first thought is, they're talking about me, and they're saying something unfavorable about me. You can't help that because it's structured into that deep identity matrix. What you can do is you can understand it and you can relax around it. Say, I say this, you know, I have this feeling that they're talking about me, but of course they're not. I'm not that important, you know. The third aspect of deep identity is the issue of class. And that plays itself out differently in this country now as opposed to us 40, 50 years ago. But in other countries, the side of town you're allowed to live on, the school you're allowed to go to, the job you're allowed to seek is all an aspect of your class, okay? The fourth aspect is religion. And again, in this society, up to about 40 years ago, and actually there's still lots of places in the society where that's a Catholic neighborhood over there, and you know the Baptists are over there. And in some cultures, the religions are so separated. I remember a guy showed me a tattoo that was on his arm that was in the shape of a cross, and he said, I grew up in Egypt, and they tattooed crosses on all of the children to identify them as Christians so they wouldn't slip over and try to act like Muslims. Okay. And the idea of branding your children like you do cattle is a part of that deep identity. And the scar that comes from the pain associated with being tattooed as a child and having and holding a stigma that long is again another aspect of that deep identity. And the last of our deep identities is gender. And so whether you were when you came from the hospital, you were either wrapped in a pink blanket or you're wrapped in a blue blanket. And from that time, you were treated differently. And now, because you know we can identify the gender of a child while they're still in utero, you treat those children differently before they're even born. You think about them differently before they're even born. Now, all this stuff turns into the fodder for the 100 wars that are going on our planet right now. It's fodder for all of the ways that we are separating ourselves from each other. We can try to solve our problems up at the top with laws and rules and regulations without paying attention to all of this deep identity stuff that's locked in our consciousness. And since it's locked in our consciousness, it's really, really hard to get it out. Now, and so if I bring people together who are divided around deep identity issues, around issues of race, ethnicity, culture, around issues of language, around issues of religion, etc., they will start beating heads because they don't even share the same reality. It's like they're from different planets. If though, we can do a little preliminary work and soften that deep identity and help them to take a step back away from their identity, then we can help them to see, oh, we're not really fighting each other. We're fighting this stuff that got stuffed into our being when we were 2 years old, sometimes without even thinking about it. Sometimes adults will say stuff to kids They don't even think about it, and it just sticks with them. If I can tell you a quick story. I was doing this work with a group of people, and we were talking about deep identity, and a woman in the group, a white woman in the group, told this story. She said her father always preached that everyone is equal, that there in the eyes of God, there's no differences between people or anything like that. And she said that when she and her brother were riding in the backseat of the car, when they got into a certain neighborhood, the father would say over his shoulder, lock your doors. And the two kids, being dutiful kids, would lock their doors. And she said she would look out the window, and the only thing that was different was that she could see black people on the streets. And she said, this woman was like in her 50s. And she said, for like 50 years, I've been afraid of black people, and I didn't know why. It wasn't, my father never said to me, be afraid of black people. But that simple gesture of, oh, look outside, lock your doors, okay, is enough to feed that deep identity. How many of us are operating from something happening in our background, something happening in the realm of deep identity? How many of us can pull ourselves away from that?
Mm-hmm. Shariff, before we go to the pulling away, I want to ask you about the neuroscience on this, because some of the work over the summer piece, the last few years, different people we've talked to said, when a person becomes frightened or afraid or triggered, the amygdala will kick in, the part of the brain which will take us to fight, flight, and freeze. And then we can narrow our identity down even more, down to just one. This Hutu, Tutsi, Democrat, Republican, Israeli, Palestinian. And so can you tell us a little bit, when you're working with deep identity and when there's fear or people are triggered, what you're doing to help get people out of that fight, flight, and freeze process?
Right. So you're absolutely right. There's all sorts of neurochemical reactions that are going on all the time, and the same thing will be true not just in terms of separating from someone, but also from thinking that you have an automatic connection with someone. Okay, and one of the first things that we do in our dialogue work of like literally bringing either actual or potential adversaries face to face with each other. The first thing I want to do is not bring them face to face. I want them to face themselves. I want to have a group of just whatever that group may be, whether it's a racial group or whether it's a class group or whatever. I want them to understand what their own issue is and talk that out a little bit. And I want them to understand that I am, my organization is the convener of this meeting, so nobody's going to attack you, okay? The other thing is I want to make sure that the extremists in each of those positions is not in the room. See, one of the things that we do is, one of the things that the media does, if they want a particular position on something, what they do is go to the most extreme position and have that person ranting and raving. And then for the other side, let's go to Mr. or Miss Extreme other side. And they're ranting and raving. And then if they want to have a dialogue, they bring them together and they rant and rave at each other with appropriate commercial breaks. And the challenge though is, can we have a reasonable dialogue between reasonable human beings who may really differ with each other, may have very, very different energies, And there's a technology for bringing them together. I mean, we've learned the technology. You have to have groups of 5 to 7. You can't have groups of 2, and you can't have groups of 20. Okay, they've got to sit at round tables. I insist on round tables. If you don't have round tables, go out and make some. Which is we had to do that a couple of times. But yeah, square table will square the conversation. And you absolutely have to have food present. There's something that happens when you have a cup of coffee or tea or something, a cookie, a biscuit or something. Your brain, this may be a different part of the brain from the amygdala, but I think there's a part of your brain that says, if I'm sitting down with you and I'm eating with you, you must be my family. Even when you have fundamentally separating issues, those people will bond together and say, we'll be back next week to talk about those fundamental issues, but we're going to be talking with each other about those issues.
Can I step in here? Because one of the things that I'm pulling from your conversation, Shariff, is that we're struggling with a more universal identity, which is the identity of spirit, which is connected to character, virtues, values, the goodness of the spirit. And, we've put on these labels or these archetypes. When we call archetypes, I look at them as labels, these physical identities. And if the publicity on my gender or on my religion or on my language has been, this one's high, you're low, there's always going to be a fight and a struggle. But really what we're missing here, isn't it, is that we really are supposed to be coming from a soul-to-soul level. Is there a way that you can talk about that? Because I call all of that stuff body consciousness. But isn't there something more uniting, which is really that energy of spirit? Is there anything in your work that, apart from good cookies and a round table, is there like this opportunity where, like how I'm looking at you in your eyes right now, and everyone who's tuned in, I don't care where you're from, I just want to have a moment with the goodness that's in your spirit.
Yes. Oh, you want it more than that? So I agree with you about all of this deep identity. The stuff that can be in our deep identity is labeling, okay, and that we can transcend that labeling. We can become bigger than that labeling. We are bigger than our labeling, okay. But I don't want to minimize the effect of how deep identity plays out, because I'll give you an example. I was working with a spiritual group, and I won't name what group, and I was talking with a very spiritually minded person, and they had read more books than I had read and had more experiences than I had had, etc. And was, they're very calm, etc. And we were walking down the street, and that person saw something. And the place that they went in seeing, what they saw was a homeless person. The place where they went when they saw that person wasn't, oh, we are all children of God and here's a child of God, etc. They went to whatever their father had said about homeless people. Okay. And it was automatic, that didn't even think about it. And when I said, well, aren't we all children of God? It's like, oh yeah, but I also have this other message about this guy down here. Okay. And so it takes, I think, a lot to get us through those automatic responses. I'm dealing with my own, I don't want to say automatic, I'm dealing with my own deep identity stuff. I got the big chunks out of the way. The likelihood I'm going to be offending major groups of people is really low nowadays. Okay, nowadays. But some of the more subtle pieces of it, some of the things that I assume about people. This is actually funny, okay? In our culture, when somebody sneezes, you say something. You may say bless you or gesundheit or whatever, but when you're in a culture when nobody reacts to it, there's no reaction whatsoever, it's like, wait, time out. We just missed something. Can we just go back and do whatever we're supposed to do? And so some of those assumptions may be funny. They may be, it makes international traveling very interesting. But some of them are not, okay? And they're not funny at all, okay? Or they may be completely funny to me and completely fine to me. This is where a lot of what the stuff that gets called racism in our society comes from. I don't call it racism because it has to do with all this deep identity stuff. That I may say something that is completely fine with me and my world. And because my world is different, because my deep identity is different, I may take it a completely different way.
Okay, so let's pick up right there. So we have these deep identities. We're interacting from these deep identities, and we're going to inevitably bump into one another, mm-hmm. and inevitably either bump into each other in a way that awakens compassion and we share a meal together, or we get triggered and we go into the stereotyping and demonizing and so forth. So you said that you bring people together from the first group, 5 to 7 people around the table, round table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Don't forget that part.
It's so funny because I actually have a chart here that describes extreme positions.
Right. Yeah.
So, and I think that's a key point here. Extreme positions will drive agendas with anger and fear. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, our media has given attention to the extreme positions, which mm-hmm. increases the anger and fear, which increases the narrow of identity.
Yep.
When most people, like the work of Search Yourself and others, is to expand the middle, mm-hmm. expand the number of people who can see common identities. Mm-hmm. And so I'd like for you to take us a couple places here. One is, after you meet with this group of 5 to 7 from their own group, how do you engage the other? And then what are some insights that people who are listening can just start to do in their own awareness about how they engage?
Right. Well, let me make one thing clear. We call these the Commons Cafe. So we sit at tables of 5 to 7 people, but we have a lot of tables, okay? A small cafe may have 5 to 7 tables or so. I guess 35, 50 people or so. We have done large commons cafes. Our largest was probably in Omaha when we had 700 people in the room, and the fire marshal wouldn't we had 100 people outside trying to get in, and they wouldn't let us in. So it was going to be nice and cozy. So if a person is in like a church or a civic association or something, they can become sponsors for this Commons Cafe. They can actually, and I just heard from some people just today, they want to they have a small town of 10,000 people. We want to do a Commons Cafe. They could do it with the whole town. And so the purpose of it is to find the common ground that's already there. Now, a lot of these things that we call the hot button issues in our society aren't hot at all. If you reframe the question and you frame it into a process that real people are in and understand, then yes, it's definitely possible to find this common ground. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I was doing some work with a reasonably large organization, 800 people, and they had lots of racial conflict going on. And the work once we reframed it away from race and into life experience, and people could then start sharing their life experiences. Some of the most, let's say, the people who would have shown up in Charlottesville wearing the white robes, okay, they realized that they had a lot in common with their Black coworkers than they thought they had, because they now had a mechanism to talk to them past all the fear-making stuff, past all the amygdala stuff, okay? So by having that methodology of being able to talk to each other, they then could build up, they could let their filters down, okay? And then they could start building up their connecting tissue, so that when something separating came up, they then would have the ability to survive it. So I'd worked with this group for a year or so. During her break, an African-American woman was taking her break outside, smoking a cigarette. A white male coworker, someone she had known for years, walked up to her, and she said, "Hey, Bill, how you doing?" And he says, "None of your goddamn business," and knocks the cigarette out of her hand and walks into the building. Now, in normal thinking, this is a major incident. This is something, I mean, he physically contacted her. He cursed at her. This could be, you could look at it as a racial incident. You could look at it as a gender incident. You could look at it as both, okay? And what she said came from my work, which was, I don't know what just happened. I have this fact pattern, but I don't know what happened. So she then did what I recommend that you do, is went to two of her coworkers, white coworkers, and said, "Let me tell you what happened from my perspective." And so she relayed this, and both of them said, "This is really not good, but this doesn't sound like him at all." Okay, so rather than having that automatic reaction, the three of them went to Bill, not just her, but all three of them, and said, "We heard that this is what happened, and can you help us understand this?" Well, Bill had just come from the hospital where he had gotten a diagnosis of lung cancer. So from his perspective, here's this woman blowing cigarette smoke in his face saying, "How you feeling?" And he said, "I lost it." And he apologized, and everybody got it. Everybody got it. And so the incident that percolated through the entire workplace wasn't Bill knocked the cigarette out of her hand, you know. What percolated through the workplace was these folks worked this out, you know, and they worked it out by talking to each other, and they worked it out by not immediately coming to, "You hurt me, so now I'm going to fix you." Okay. So go ahead.
No, what I'm loving about this is how we started off from the personal perspective, and we talked about the identity crisis that we're going through and that we need to dig deeper. And now you've given a great example of an interpersonal engagement, that if we can just talk with each other more and find out what actually is going on to see what we have more in common, can actually create more harmony and more peace and the common ground that we're looking for. But what really got me, Shariff, was when you said then the whole office looked at it as in the collective, that they worked it out.
Yep.
That they worked it out, and it could have been a race card.
Yep.
Yes, and come back to a little bit more about the preparation that this person had, not just to react.
Right.
What was that preparation? And so people who are listening can potentially gain some insights here.
Yeah, so I do a consulting training work. It will, depending on the organization and depending on how stuck they are, it could take 1 or 2 or 3 sessions. But we just go through this, where we spend a couple of hours looking at deep identity, going through each one of the aspects, and watching the lights going on around the room of, oh, yeah, I do that, or that's the way I act. We talk about filtering and how I can choose to set my filters low or high, okay? I'll give you a great example of filtering. This just happened to me a couple of months ago. And I have to say, I'm getting of the age that it could have happened a couple of years ago. So I'm walking down the street. A woman is walking with me, and she has a child, like maybe 9 years old, African-American woman, African-American child. I'm making the assumption that this is her grandchild, okay? And the grandkid is kicking a piece of wood down the street. This is a game that an 8 or 9 year old would come up with in a second, and I'm sure he had rules and everything. And he'd kick it, and it would land, and kick it again, it would land, and it was really unclear where the wood would land, etc. So I'm walking toward him, and a white guy is walking across the street toward them, and there's going to be like this 3-way intersection, and I wasn't sure. This kid was like 1 kick away, and I wasn't sure where the wood would land. Okay, so it's like a harmless game. Okay, so I stopped to let him kick the wood, and he stopped to not kick the wood while I was passing, and the white guy stopped because he saw all this happening. So we all stopped, and then we started walking because the kid didn't kick the wood. And as I'm passing the woman, she says, "Did you see that white guy? He stopped because my grandson was kicking this wood, like my grandson was going to kick him or something." Now, both of us stopped, but she only saw him. She was waiting for something bad to happen, okay? She couldn't see that I had done exactly the same movement, and the movement was completely reasonable considering the fact that we didn't know the kid was going to kick or not, okay? And so my ability to dial up or dial down my response or reaction to various things in life is really, really important. There are some things that I should, I mean, if he had, walked by and pushed the kid to the ground or something like that, no, that's not something that you say, oh, that's just a matter of filtering, okay? But a lot of the things that happen, I choose to be offended by it. I choose to be offended by your choice of words. I choose to be offended by the way you looked, or the way you act, or the way you smirked, or a way I thought that you might have smirked, etc. And so what I do in my training is I just want you to be aware of your filtering, okay? That all of us are filtering. When I see people doing diversity training or race training, etc., we act like only white people are offensive. Only white people have privilege. Only white people commit microaggressions. That's simply not the case, okay? It may be on some planet other than this one, but I see all of us in this soup, and I see all of us interacting. And I see all of us having the capacity for love. I see all of us having the capacity for hate. And I see all of us as having the capacity to make a choice. And that's the only thing that I do in my 1 or 2 or 3 days of training, is to get people to make that choice, to get people to see that they can be choiceful, to get people to see that if you're doing the exact same behavior you're complaining about, maybe you shouldn't be complaining about the behavior, or maybe you should get your fecal matter together.
Okay. Excellent. Sharif's sister? Or
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's why they're complaining, because they can see it in themselves. And the question is, where do I go with fixing that inside?
No, that's a major issue right there. That I complain about the parts of me that are not reconciled in me.
Exactly.
I'm trying to hold you responsible for the things that are happening inside of me. That's not the way it works.
And this is what I feel that the time that we're in and why we're finding common ground, especially opening up the show with this conversation, is there is an identity crisis. Mm-hmm. There is a language crisis. I'm raised in America, and I have a lot of Indians around me. Mm-hmm. And to this day, they'll tell me I should have learned Hindi. Mm-hmm. And I go, I'm fine. I speak 8 different languages. I might not have mastered Hindi. Okay, give me a break here. Yeah. And so it doesn't even matter. It's your own people will constantly be on your case that you must be like them in this genre. Mm-hmm. You spoke about the status quo. Mm-hmm. You spoke about the whole gender, attachment to gender. Mm-hmm. All of these things, I think we have to play out these parts. But I think we're missing the qualitative personality, the personality of beauty, the divine calling, the God-centered you, to play your role as a gay or a straight person, to play your good role as a Democrat or Republican. If you're like God-centered, won't you be a good African-American or a good Caucasian-American? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what this wake-up call is, and this is how we're going to find common ground, is if we can go beyond the labels and the skin.
And what I love, Sister and Sharif, also is, there's this whole spiritual component, and it's back to neuroscience. We're wired for fight, flight, and freeze. We're wired for compassion. We're wired for lots of things. And so these choices you're talking about, in terms of looking at the macro picture of the need for common ground, it really comes back to
the choice that you made.
What's happening in between
and your
filter,
and because we all have filters, as Sharif was saying. Yep. There's something that I just wish mainstream media would cover conversations like this, because they're feeding this thing so much. And my empathy for those of my brothers and sisters who are just trapped in this tunnel vision, of just that, when there's so much more waiting for them to appreciate.
Can I react to a little bit of that, though? I know you got a question, Philip.
Well, no, we're just going to need to wrap up here soon, Sharif. So.
Are you kidding?
No.
I just get it.
All good things come to an end, Sharif.
So let me say a couple of things really quick. Sister Jenna was talking about the idea of an identity crisis, and I think that we're in an entire society with an identity crisis. Mikhail Gorbachev said this during the perestroika era. He said to all Americans, please forgive me for denying you an enemy. Okay. It's almost as though America exists by having an externalized enemy. And we lose that sense of identity unless I've got someone there. The people that I see, the so-called alt-right folks and the so-called alt-left folks bashing each other's heads in the parks, these are all people who are in essence losers. They feel that they are losing. They feel that they are empty inside, and they're trying to force an identity that the media is more than happy to give them by giving them that level of publicity. And so, yes, we have to, and there's a reason why we have more and more and more news, and we have more and more and more suicide, okay? So what we need to do is recognize that our core identity is not going to be ever talked about at that media level. We have to become our own core media, okay? We have to talk with each other. I was talking with a friend who, I was in my coffee house. I pay the rent every time I go. there are these two guys sitting at the table in front of me. And they sat down and they started off the conversation with, "Isn't Trump a jerk?" And they sat down for 2 hours and did nothing. I had to actually put my headphones on because I didn't want to hear this, and they thought that they were being really enlightened. They thought they were being really smart, etc., and they weren't. Okay. And so in the end of 2 hours, they had accomplished nothing. They had created nothing. They had not built a path to a future that I want to live in by just going, la, 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 isn't Trump a jerk? The opposite of that was Václav Havel before he became president of the Czech Republic, when he was in prison. Havel was talking to another prisoner inside the prison for 10 minutes before the guards broke him up. And for 10 minutes, instead of complaining about the prison, they talked about the nature of the society they would create when they got out of the prison. So they took Havel out of the prison, dusted him off, put a tie on him, and made him the president. They took the other guy out of prison, dusted him off, put a tie on him, and made him the foreign secretary. Okay, so these two guys in the coffee house are not ready to lead a society because they're too busy, isn't Trump a jerk? And so I invite all of us to elevate our sights and elevate our conversations.
Which you just did, because I think you ended on a very optimistic note. I'm tired of that conversation too. I think giving blessings and beginning to spearhead an age of truth is the proactive way that we need to move. Well, listen, I think this was a great opening for our Finding Common Ground. Thank you, Shariff Abdullah.
Well, thank you. It's always wonderful talking with both of you.
Same here.
Yeah.
Yes, and for everyone who's listening, just gratitude here for you being part of this, for Shariff, Sister Jenna, and let's have some fun the next 3 days. Engage on Facebook or Twitter, or hashtag Summer of Peace. Share your own stories and insights of common ground, and let's all do some deep reflecting about our deep identities and take responsibility for our part of our piece. And
what would be great is if everybody could send out like a quote, something that really moved your spirit when you heard it. Just that one quote. I think that would be awesome, and then we can just collect it at the end of the summit.
Oh, that sounds great.
Right, that'd be awesome.
Again, Shariff, thank you, my friend.
Thank you.